Salaam Alaikum. Mr. Moderator, our distinguished guests, brothers and sisters, our friends and our enemies.
Chester, and I wrote a book called The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America. And in that book, I take a look at the financial cost of discrimination against Black people. Normally, when people talk about discrimination, they tend to speak about it from the perspective of the injustice or the immorality associated with it. I wanted to look at it from the perspective of what is the cost? And more importantly, what does research from the finest institutions in the country say that cost is? So the book is broken into 3 parts. In the first part, I take a look at the financial cost of discrimination in the present day, like right now, in markets and areas that are really critical for wealth accumulation in the Black community. So that's the housing space, it's the automotive space, it's the insurance and financing behind that. It is the job search, it's high-end careers, it's online commerce, it's capital raising for business, so on and so forth. In the second part of the book, I do a look back from the time of slavery and kind of walk forward up into the present and really just go through a bunch of discriminatory practices that you guys may have heard of, but I look at it in terms of the economics, right? What was the cost? In the third part of the book, I take a look at kind of where are we right now economically. I introduce this framework, this economic framework called PhD, which stands for Purchase, Hire, and Deposit in ways that create jobs, create and expand business, and provide capital, money, right, in the Black community. Why is that really important? Because, pre-COVID, we were missing about 6 million jobs across the broader Black community. And we were also missing 1.4 million businesses with employees. You may know that there are about 2.5 million, 6 million Black businesses. Unfortunately, of that total number, only about 4% of those have any employees, right? That 4% represents about 109,000 businesses. That 4% generates 70% of all the revenue from Black business, about $100 billion, and employs about 1 million people. And while we have 109,000 of those businesses, we're missing 1.4 million, right? And that, of course, is driving the gap in capital or net worth that we have in our families and our communities, which is in the many, many trillions of dollars. Here's the challenge when it comes to effective problem solving. It's really tough to work with folks on solving a problem if A, they don't see the problem, or B, if they think you're the problem, right? So if you would just fix you, then we would be great. And I'll share a couple of platitudes with you that you may have heard. One of those are that Black folks are just simply not trying hard enough. That really has more to do with not getting ahead than any type of racial discrimination. You've got over 6 in 10 Americans that believe that. Or you may have heard that Black folks have the same chance as anybody else to get ahead in America, right? Over 6 in 10 Americans believe that as well. Or you might have heard that racism is an excuse for failure. The problem is mine. And instead of me taking responsibilities from my actions or inactions, I spend all my time blaming everybody else, right? Over, about 7 in 10 Americans believe that. The challenge is if that's the background thinking, right, then that thinking is going to show up in the policies and the plans and the programs that are designed to actually solve issues that affect our. Now, one of the things that's really important for us to understand is to be able to really effectively solve problems, you got to have 2 important things at the foundation, at the basis. One is empathy, just your ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, to see things from their perspective and to understand how they got there, right, which we call the pathology. And the other piece of it is understanding. And that's how we use data and information to make the world a better place for ourselves and for our fellow man. Now, the first thing I need us all to understand that slavery by definition is a 100% tax on your labor. It means nothing that you produce is yours, right? As a matter of fact, not even you are yours. And there's many things from this period of time that we could never put a price on, right? That we could never value. We could never value what it is to be a woman and to be unable to control your body for the entirety of your life. We could never value what it is to be a man and to be unable to protect your loved ones, right? Your wife or mom or daughter, so on and so forth, right? But there are things that you can value. And one of those things is the labor extracted from millions of people over over almost a 250-year period, right? And economists have taken a look at that. Some place the value of that labor extracted from 1619 to 1865 as high as 24 trillion. Others place the number as high as 97 trillion. If we assume that the truth is somewhere in the middle, you can say it's as high as $50 trillion, labor extracted from millions of people for almost a 250-year period. That number is massive, and it may be new to you, but that's not the only thing that we can value, right, from that time. If you go back to 1860, you've got almost 4 million people held in bondage, right? They represent 50% of the full economic value of the South. They are the most liquid asset in the country, and they are traded, bought and sold on open markets. So there are prices for these people, right? And there's a price if you're old or young, male, female, able-bodied, or lame. So it turns out that the value of these folks is so large, it's so significant that you have to put it in terms of national wealth or national income, right? So economists put the value in terms of US wealth between 16 and 20% of US wealth, or 1 to 2 years of GDP, which is just a fancy way of saying the national income, right? So if you look at it from a wealth perspective, it's about $15.5 trillion. US wealth in 2016 was about 85 trillion. 16 to 20% of that is 14 to 17 trillion. If you take an average of those two, you're at 15.5. If you look at it from an income perspective, it's about $28.5 trillion. National income is roughly, this is pre-COVID, about 19 trillion a year, right? So 1 to 2 years is 19 to 38 trillion. If you take an average of those, you're at 28.5. That's two different ways to come up with the value of what those people are worth in today's dollars. If you take an average of those two, we're at 22 trillion, right? If you go back to 1839, Henry Clay in the US Senate is putting a value on people held in bondage at that time. And he places that value at $1.2 billion at that time, right? Slave-related returns from investments in slavery is 6 to 8% per year. If we take something that's even lower than that at 5.5, and you put that in today's dollars, it'll be over $24 trillion. If you go back to the 1810s, you have Thomas Jefferson, we are all familiar with, and James Madison, and they placed the value of Black people held in bondage at their time at roughly 1 year of national income or GDP. That would be the equivalent of $19 trillion today, or they say it would require the sale of 1/3 of all public lands. The point here is that the value of these folks with respect to the country is enormous and massive and really, hard to conceive.
Bismillah wa salatu wa salam rasulullah wa ba'd. In the name of Allah, and may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon His last and final messenger, as to what follows. Family, friends, foes, haters, and hateettes, welcome back to the Feachaz. I greet you all in peace and love with no hatred in my heart. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So before we begin, please like, please subscribe, please share, please hit me up on Patreon. As you know, we got a lot of haters up in here. Also, we do have memberships now on the Feachaz, and we do ask that you please subscribe to our mirror sites. That is the infamous Feachaz on YouTube and the Feachaz on Library. That's the Feachaz at lbry.com. Simply because it's only a matter of time before we get shut down again. So let's get right into it. Family, for those of you who can recall when Joe Biden was in the running for the President of the United States, one of the things that he told Black people is that if you don't vote for Joe Biden, you are not Black. And also, you're irrelevant, buck dancing, boot dancing, booty shaking, twerking, twirling, break dancing, tap dancing, shucking and jiving, irrelevant civil rights leadership also told you that you must vote Joe Biden and don't ask for anything because we need to get Donald Trump out of office. So the question during this time that kept coming up over and over from the awakening Black masses was the question of reparations. And this question kept coming up over and over. And I would like to remind you of what Joe Biden said during one of the debates.
He's asked, I don't know what her name is, but one of the ABC people asked him this question quoted him, and the quote in and of itself is bad enough. The answer was even worse.
I want to come to you and talk to you about inequality in schools and race. In a conversation about how to deal with segregation in schools back in 1975, you told a reporter, "I don't feel responsible for the sins of my father and grandfather. I feel responsible for what the situation is today, for the sins of my own generation, and I'll be damned if I feel responsible to pay for what happened 300 years ago." You said that some 40 years ago. But as you stand here tonight, what responsibility do you think that Americans need to take to repair the legacy of slavery in our country?
Pause it for 1 second. Now, Heather, I mean, you tell me. I mean, I think that's a fair question. She really set it up in such a way of like, that was 40 years ago. I accept that your attitude towards this may have changed. But frankly, you know, if somebody said that today, it would be a right-winger would be saying that.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that is the idea that like, I don't have to pay. Well, no, you don't have to pay. Society has to pay. You're part of society. We do that all the time, right? Like if in a municipality, the police arrest somebody illegally and they're sued, we all pay.
I just want to interject here. The reality is, with the fiat currency system, particularly in the United States, they have an unlimited supply of money, and they can essentially pay for whatever they want. However, they don't have the will to pay for anything for Black people, nor the desire. As a matter of fact, the plans for Black people are completely and totally different than the plans for everybody else. And we'll establish this later. But anyways, let's continue.
For the compensation that, you know, because our apparatus did something that was wrong and people deserve to be recompensated. I mean, this is a very easy concept to grasp. So she's given the opportunity to basically say, I've evolved, or, you know, that was taken out of context, whatever it is. But this is the jibber jabber he comes up with. And I don't know, he smiled when she started this question. I don't know if it was why he did that, if it was just a nervous smile or like, I knew this was coming, or I don't know what was behind that. But here it is.
Americans need to take to repair the legacy of slavery in our country.
Well, they have to deal with look, there is institutional segregation in this country. And from the time I got involved, I started dealing with that. Redlining, banks, making sure that we are in a position where, look, we talk about education. I propose that what we take is those very poor schools, the Title I schools, triple the amount of money we spend, from 15 to 45 billion a year. Give every single teacher a raise to the equal raise of getting out the $60,000 level. Number two, make sure that we bring in to help the teachers deal with the problems that come from home. The problems that come from home, we have one school psychologist for every 1,500 kids in America.
All right, pause it for 1 second. So here, Biden goes, I mean, right? This is not some guy who it's the first debate he's ever been in. This is stunning that he doesn't have the ability to answer this question with any type of coherence. But aside from the fact that he's not addressing slavery, aside from him just like trying to go down this idea of like, I fought segregation, and realizing like, oh, wait, I shouldn't bring that up because I was praising segregationists, 6 weeks ago. Then he tries to pivot to education, and he gets One, he immediately pivots from what are we going to do about slavery that affected African Americans to just the question of poverty. So he is now, in his mind, immediately goes to poor people living in urban areas, which is we're starting to get into like Daniel Moynihan territory here, which is very uncomfortable territory too, because not only does he gets the idea that our education problems are a function of poverty, but he then just basically says, but we got to put it on the schools to deal with it because we need psychiatrists at the schools. And then he pivots to full-on Moynihan territory where he basically starts blaming these poor people for their inability to do the right thing for their kids to go to school. And remember now, when he says poor people, he's saying black people in his mind because the question was about slavery. Go ahead.
come from home. We have one school psychologist for every 1,500 kids in America today. It's crazy. The teachers are retired. I'm married to a teacher. My deceased wife is a teacher. They have every problem coming to them. We have to make sure that every single child does, in fact, have 3, 4, and 5-year-olds go to school, not daycare, school. We bring social workers into homes of parents to help them deal with how to raise their children. It's not that they don't want to help. They don't know quite what to do. Play the radio. Make sure the television, make sure you have the record player on at night, the phone. Make sure the kids hear words. A kid coming from a very poor school, or a very poor background, will hear 4 million words fewer spoken by the time they get there.
All right, pause it. So,
oh my God.
Now look, the question of a vocabulary deficit is a little bit controversial. I happen to believe, I don't think it's 4 million words, but the listening vocabulary of kids living in poverty is definitely lower. But the reason is not because their parents are home and not playing the records for them. It's because the parents are constantly dealing with poverty, and either in the form of like, I've got multiple jobs, or I can't afford to send my kid to the universal pre-K that I think he was trying to suggest. And I don't know that he has a UPK program, frankly. And he is just going full on saying that these people don't know how to raise their children. Now, remember, he's talking about black people. That was the question.
So the reason why Joe Biden answered that question in such a manner is obviously because no reparations are coming for black people. But at the same time, the Democratic Party is under tremendous pressure from the wider black community, as well as other elements that are friendly to reparations, such as elements from the white community, the Hispanic community, the indigenous community. All these elements are coming together and agreeing that 100% black people are owed reparations. Now, this pressure was felt particularly when Kamala Harris was asked about reparations. This is what she said.
Do you support reparations for black people?
Well, listen. Again, we had over 200 years of slavery. We had Jim Crow for almost a century. We had legalized discrimination, segregation, and now we have segregation and discrimination that is not legal but still exists and is a barrier to progress. We have disparities around housing. We have disparities around education. We have disparities around income. And we have to recognize that everybody did not start out on an equal footing in this country. And in particular, black people have not. And so we have got to recognize that and do something about that and give folks a lift up. That's why, for example, I'm proposing the LIFT Act. Give people who are making $100,000 or less as a family a tax credit, which will benefit and uplift 60% of black families who are in poverty.
So by default, it affects black families, but there's not a particular policy for African Americans that you would explore.
But no, if you look at the reality of who will benefit from certain policies, when you take into account that they're not starting at the same place and they're not starting on equal footing, it will directly benefit black children, black families, black homeowners, because the disparities are so significant. So if we focus on the specific issues that have resulted in the greatest disparities, and we understand that that's part of why we're doing it. Listen, the reality also is this: any policy that will benefit black people will benefit all of society. Let's be clear about that. Let's really be clear about that. So I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No, because whatever benefits that black family will benefit that community and society as a whole and the country.
This strategy of telling black people that anything that we do that benefits the country will automatically benefit black people, and therefore we're going to benefit all people, and we're not going to benefit anything specifically for black people, not only is a lie and it's deceptive, but it's a tactic, a very old tactic that has been used by many different countries in order to keep black people as a permanent underclass. It's not a new tactic, particularly in the States. It was first done with the Civil War, promising black people 40 acres and a mule. Not to mention what happened in Haiti, and the Haitians are suffering from these tactics from this very day, where they were promised freedom as long as they paid the French government so many millions of dollars. Not to mention every single colonized African country, where some of these countries are taxed up to 30% by their colonizing states. So it's not a new tactic. It's an old tactic. Rather, the surprising and astonishing thing is that how often black people have fallen for this wicked lie. And I do say wicked lie, and that's an understatement. Now, black people waiting, saying that you have to wait because we have this thing which is more important and that thing which is more important, and we'll get to you. Who are we to wait? Who are we to wait? Either we are included in the larger society or we're not. But they're too cowardly to say that you're excluded, so they just tell you to wait. And one of these tactics of waiting is when Joe Biden said that he'll look into reparations.
The president during the campaign supported the study for reparations, the committee to study reparations. There was a House Judiciary Committee hearing today. Does the president support the legislation? He stopped short of saying that during the campaign. Would he sign that if it came to his desk?
Well, he's supported a study of reparations, which I believe is what's being discussed, and studying the continuing impacts of slavery, which is being discussed in this hearing on H.R. 40, I believe it is. And he continues to demonstrate his commitment to take comprehensive action to address the systemic racism that persists today. Obviously, that is having that study is a part of that, but he has signed an executive order on his first day, which would begin to deliver on his commitment to having an across government approach to addressing racial inequality and making sure equity is a part of his entire policy agenda.
I want to be crystal clear. Black people are no longer asking for equality, or equity for that matter. We've seen what equality and equity looks under you devils for the last few hundred years. And the devil and those who worship Allah can never be equal. But the awakening black masses have been asking for reparations. Or what did Joe Biden say he'll do again?
But he certainly would support a study of reparations. We understands that we don't need a study to take action right now in systemic racism, so he wants to take actions within his own government in the meantime.
So Joe Biden said he want to study reparations before he give reparations for black people. Because 400 years of slavery, 85 years of Jim Crow, mass incarceration, with the war on drugs, the destruction of the black family through black feminism, COINTELPRO, and on and on and on, wasn't enough. He needs to study. He needs to study reparations for black people. But how long did he study the anti-Asian hate bill before he gave the Asian community $156 million? And how long did he study before he gave the anti-LGBTQ hate bill $100 million? And how long did he study before he asked Congress for $30 billion for Afghan relief? And how long did he study after giving Israel $3.8 billion? Yes, it was an extension of the Obama bill, but still, Israelis got $3.8 billion under the Biden administration. But now Joe Biden has another group that he wants to give reparations to.
In immigration news, the Wall Street Journal reports the Biden administration's in negotiations to pay millions of dollars in reparations to families who were separated at the U.S.-Mexico border under Trump's zero-tolerance policy. The payments would amount to $450,000 per person. This comes as part of efforts to settle several lawsuits filed on behalf of hundreds of separated parents and children who say they're still suffering from emotional distress, trauma, and psychological harm.
You see, the Biden administration found very specific money for the Asians, very specific money for the LGBTQs, very specific reparations for the illegal immigrants, not citizens, by the way, very specific money for Afghan relief, very specific money for Israel, completely different country, and on and on and on. All this under Biden administration. But when black people are asking for specific reparations, can we get some specific reparations, Kamala Harris?
So I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No.
Now, I want everybody to understand that this is not just official Harris-Biden policy. Because this issue didn't start with Biden and Harris. This issue's been here for a very long time. And it's an international policy in order to keep black people internationally as a permanent underclass. And ever since black people were offered 40 acres and a mule in the States and never got it, that has been the plot and the plan of these devils since that time, to always permanently offer black people a whole bunch of talk and give them a whole bunch of nothing. But what is the cost? What would have happened if black people actually got that 40 acres and a mule in a civil war?
Which is, if you take all the assets and all the liabilities and subtract the two, what's left? 45 million plus, African Americans today, it's roughly $1.5 trillion. But we just established that 4 million people held in bondage in 1860, over 150 years ago, had an economic value of about 22 trillion in today's equivalent. That means that 4 million people held in bondage in 1860 were worth 15 times more than 45 million people who are free today, right? 153 years later. That's just the math. Well, why is it that black people have not done well, right? There's been plenty of time to correct that. And here's the challenge with that. Those people left bondage with no economic resources, right? If you go back to 1870, black folks own about 0.17% of U.S. wealth, effectively nothing. And I'm sure you remember from social studies or history class, they kind of talk about 40 acres and a mule and the Homestead Act, right? We all know that 40 acres and a mule was never actually distributed. That was a discussion about providing some startup capital in terms of land and a mule to help newly freed people get a start in life post-emancipation. What I always thought was interesting is, what would that have been worth in today's dollars, right? Both the 40 acres and a mule and the Homestead Act. So if we take a look at that, you got, 4 million people held in bondage, 40 acres, per person is 160 million acres. It's just a gigantic amount of land. If you look at the cost of an acre in the US, it varies between roughly $3,020 and $6,350. By the way, this is farmland that we're talking about. We are not talking about, LA acres or Bay Area acres or Manhattan or Miami or any of that kind of stuff, right? This is just kind of farmland. Quick math puts that as high as $1 trillion in today's equivalent, which would be generating about $90 billion a year. That's what that would have been worth economically if it had been distributed in today's dollars. But that never occurred. And even though that 1 trillion is a really large number, it's only about 2% of the 50 trillion that was extracted from those folks and from their predecessors. Passed an act called the Homestead Act, in which they would proceed to distribute 246 million acres to about 1.5 million white families, right? Over the next 60-year period, massive distribution of land. If we look at it from the same perspective, in terms of the value of an acre of farmland, it would place the value of that distribution at about $1.6 trillion, or roughly about $1 million per family. Now, I'm all about hard work and bootstraps, but $1 million is a hell of a start, right? In life. So how did this thing work? The way it worked was that you had the opportunity to claim about 160 acres, right, of land. And if you were so fortunate to be able to make that claim, if you stayed on that land for about 5 years, you could take possession of it at the end of it without actually paying anything for it. Now, if you were from Europe and you came over here, and you came with nothing but the shirt on your back, which many people did, and you were so fortunate to be able to claim one of these lots, at the end of 5 years, not only did you take possession of that land, but you also could naturalize or become a citizen, because that's how long it took you to become a citizen, back in those days. So imagine coming from a land of destitution to a land of plenty and having a start like this. Now, researchers say that in terms of direct beneficiaries, there's up to 93 million Americans that are direct beneficiaries of this. So not secondary, tertiary, they're related to it in some way or form, direct beneficiaries, right? So on the one hand, you've got $1 trillion of economic resources denied to a group for whom so much was taken from in the first place, and then, almost 2 trillion distributed to, 1.5 million, white families.
And these are the same people that got the damn nerve to tell us to pick ourselves up by our bootstraps. Now, remember I said in the beginning that in a fiat market system, or a fiat monetary system rather, that if they want to allocate money to whatever project it is, they will find the money. And they will do exactly that. What they are telling you is that they don't want to allocate any money towards black people. That's what they're telling you. And we're going to prove it. Now, Jim Crow Joe Biden's reparation bonanza, since he became president, it started with the anti-Asian bill. That's $156 million. Okay? Then his LGBTQ anti-hate bill, $100 million. Then it was his proposed Afghan relief fund, $30 billion. Then he sent $3.8 billion to Israel. Yes, it was under Obama administration, but still, okay? And now the brand new illegal immigrant package, which offers each illegal immigrant $450,000, and it's a bill of $1 billion. That's a total of $35.56 billion under the Biden administration alone. He became president at the end of 2020. Are y'all hearing me? So in 1 year, he found, or is attempting to find, $35 billion for everybody else except for black people. But wait, there's more. We also have from before Joe Biden, because remember what I said, this is official U.S. policy to keep black people in a state of benign neglect and to keep them as a permanent underclass. How do you know? Because in the last 3 decades, the U.S. government has spent $552 billion, that's $1 billion, on Israel, a different country that has nothing to do with the States. In the 1980s, under the Reagan administration, Ronald Reagan gave Japanese Americans an equivalent of $3.8 billion for a 2-year internment camp, or prison camps that they were sent to during World War II. That was under the Reagan administration. The Afghan war started with, it ended at $2 trillion they found to fight this Afghan war. Not to mention the Iraq war, another $2 trillion that they found to fight in Iraq. So that is $4.5 trillion. $4.5 trillion they found for other projects. We didn't talk about Vietnam. Okay? We didn't talk about all the other wars around Somalia and all these other projects that they have in Africa, the Arab Spring, the Gulf War, first Gulf War. We didn't talk about any of that stuff. Desert Storm. You understand? But they found the money for all these other projects. But what about how much these devils stole from black people in modern times? What do you mean? We're not even talking about slavery or Jim Crow anymore. We're talking, for example, the loss of wealth from redlining only. That's not including interest. So for redlining only, black people, the loss of wealth in the black community was $156 billion. The war on drugs. The war on drugs, the American government spent, they put money into the war on drugs, which decimated the black community, and they spent $1 trillion in the active destruction of the black community. They also spent $1.6 trillion on mass incarceration since 1995. This is how much money they invested in destroying the black community. That can be accounted for in modern times. We're not talking about slavery anymore. You understand? So the total amount that this government has, the US government only, we're not talking about Brazil, the West Indies, Africa, just in the USA, the amount of money they invested in the active destruction of the black community is $2,756,000,000. Are y'all hearing me? In modern times. So that means for every black man, woman, and child, 44 million of them in the States, the US government spends $62,636 on their destruction. But when Joe Biden was asked how much is he gonna give black folk for reparations, what did he say, y'all? What did he say? He gave you a whole bunch of gibberish. And up until this very day, if you count how much money every single colonial power, including the United States, has spent in the reparations of black people internationally, you know how much money you got?
So if we fast period of the Civil War and emancipation, the Southern economy is devastated, right? The global cotton market is devastated. The land confiscated in the South is returned to the white planter class. What we have to remember is because of the rebellion of the South, which is actual literal treason, all of their land was confiscated by the North. So it did not belong to them, but it was returned to them after they were defeated. And the world, people need large, cheap, readily available labor. Now, I'm gonna just circle back here because there's a lot that's going on during this period. The short version is the global cotton market employed about 20 million people. 1 million of those people lost their jobs. Cotton was the equivalent of oil in terms of its effect. Raw cotton from the United States dominated 80% of the total market. And raw cotton picked by Black people in the South was about 61% of US export. I mean, you just can't beat free labor and the global dominance, associated with what Black people in the South were doing. And the economic value of those people is 50% of everything in the South. So, and the Civil War creates this thing called a global cotton famine, which is all these industrialized countries that are using this raw material. They don't have it. They don't have as much. So it affects Egypt, it affects India, it affects Europe, it affects Japan, it affects like the whole industrial world. So the world is crying out, what is America going to do to put her newly freed people back to work, right? And the answer and a solution to that is this thing that we call Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow of laws and customs that's reinforced with an extraordinary level of violence to reimpose 100% tax on a sharecropper's labor. Now, I know it sounds hyperbolic. I know it sounds like I'm going overboard by saying 100% tax on people's labor after slavery, right? But what I will do is I will let you decide whether or not you think it really is 100% tax. So let's talk about this kind of sharecropping, what it is, and how does it work. So after emancipation, those large mega plantations were broken into smaller lots, right? Black families would agree to settle on those lots and plant cash crops. And at the end of the season, they would share in a portion of the crop that they brought to market. Literally, that's where the name comes from, sharecropping. What we got to understand is it was an actual contract that the family signed, right, with a white landowner. All the terms and conditions of that contract were set by the small white farmer. Some of those terms and conditions said that if you fell ill during that harvest and you couldn't do your work, they could outsource it to somebody else, have somebody else do it, and then charge you back for what it costs them to have somebody else do your portion of it. The other thing that we have to understand is that those people left with virtually no economic resources whatsoever. And if the harvest doesn't come tomorrow, it comes at the end of the year or at the end of the season. So between now and then, that farmer has to provide you with the tools and the fertilizer and clothes and house and meals, everything that you need, right? And they're doing that on credit at interest rates as high as 70% per year. So they're setting what all your expenses are, right? And the value of your expenses. The other thing is that at the end of the year, when you take these crops to market, that white farmer is the market. That person tells you what your crops are worth. Now think about this. If a person controls your costs and they control your revenue, your income, because they tell you what it's worth, by definition, that means they control your profit. And I think you start to see where I mean by 100% tax, right? So if you're fortunate, your profit will be zero at the end of the year. If you're unfortunate, because they don't want you to go to someone else who might be more generous, your profit will be negative, which means you owe them. They'll roll that into next year, and now you're in perpetual debt servitude. Very difficult to accumulate wealth and resources under this kind of construct, right? And then you can get to the other side. But this wasn't a bad 3 or 4 year period, or even 5 year period, or even 10 year period, right? This thing lasted for roughly 75 years, from about 1870 or so to about 1945, during which time 4,000 Black people were lynched. That's a public execution by your fellow American, right? Nobody's been prosecuted for those executions. It's the equivalent of one Black person per week being executed for 75 years, right? Under those types of conditions, you'll get the hint, your family gets the hint, your church gets the hint, your community gets the hint.
So now we have a long legacy in the line of Jim Crow, Joe Biden, dating back for hundreds of years, of the ruling class not having the will or desire to do what is right by their former slaves. And they've committed every single type of atrocity that they can possibly think of. But now, there's a new Negro. You have now a class of Black people who've accepted Islam as their religion. And we are saying, we don't want your civil rights. We don't want your laws. We don't want your money. We're done complaining to you. As a matter of fact, we're complaining to one who is much more powerful than you, much more generous than you. And here's our call. And all we have to do to get this generous one to answer our call is to obey him. So we're coming to you like Moses came to Pharaoh, with a good word and telling you to fear your Lord. But if you decide that you think you're going to keep doing what you're doing, that there is no rock you can hide under from Allah Himself, As for us, we're turning to Allah. You've made your position very clear for the last 400 plus years. And our Prophet, ﷺ, he said, a believer doesn't get stung by the same hole twice. We're not waiting to get stung by y'all anymore. A new day is coming. And all you can do is get with it or get out the way. Subhanaka bihamdik wa shadu lana ant wa astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.